are leaders in the world who are made for impact.
You are trying to help influence people to do the thing that needs to be done. I think great leaders do that in a way that's about the other person. How is this opportunity for them? How is the thing that needs to be done structured in a way that works for them, lets their life be complete as a whole person, whatever those things look like. I'm a big proponent of servant leadership. You will never get somewhere with the person across the table from you if they don't trust you, if they don't feel safe. You're not going to be effective. And so you have to focus on that part first before you even attempt it.
I'm Gretchen Schott, and this is Made for Impact, a show for leaders who want to leave a lasting impact on their organizations, their teams, and their lives.
My guest today is Beth Rashleigh, founder, coach, author. Beth and I met through mutual friends and connections, and I liked her style so much that I hired her to teach an emotional intelligence class for our emerging leader program through Grow You. Her personal mission is to empower leaders with the inspiration, awareness, and skill they need to lead exceptional teams. She's the author of Crisis Proof Leadership, a certified coach with the International Coaching Federation, and she once held a role as a training manager for the CIA. You can bet we dig into that experience, as well as talk about coaching and influencing. Take a listen. Beth, thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to have you on the show.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Can you share a little bit about your journey and your experience in coaching and the influencing space?
So I've been working in leadership development for pretty close to 20 years now, which feels really strange at this phase of life to say. I started out more in training and facilitation inside corporations and the federal government. And then I went out on my own as a consultant and coach about 4 years ago. It's been a magical space. It's also not without its challenges. I started my business in November of 2019, which was excellent timing for all the things that changed in our lives in 2020.
I didn't realize that it's only been 4 years. I feel like you've been doing this for so long. That's like nothing. You're just, I don't know. That's really, really cool.
I have to remind myself sometimes I am just a baby entrepreneur.
I don't see you that way. I think of you as very wise. So going from like training to coaching, what kind of sparked your interest in coaching and how did you get started with that?
Yeah, so I started when I was still working for the government. So I used to work for the CIA, which some people know, and I was part of a leadership development facilitation team there. And we did intact programs with groups a lot where each leader have a coach in those programs. That was really my first exposure to coaching as a practice and especially focused on leadership. And I had several colleagues that were certified and much wiser in that space than I was. But they were kind enough to kind of hold me up with some tools and some help to help me kind of start baby stepping my way into that space. And I fell in love with it right away. You know, as much as I love being in a classroom, there's also something really magical about just holding space for whatever somebody needs to talk about. And I don't ever get tired of that privilege of somebody trusting you with hard stuff that's going on in their life. So I started doing it kind of light. And then I decided to get certified in 2016, I bet. I started pursuing my certification. And honest to God, I walked into that thinking, okay, I've already been coaching. I'm just going to check a box so I can put my credentials down. And boy, was I in for a rude awakening. You know, it's a year of training. I failed my exam the first time. Like, it's no joke. Like, you work, even if you know what you're doing. So I've been certified and credentialed for about 6 years now. And again, I just feel so much more equipped to really be able to help people because of that work I did on the front end.
Yeah. Well, I love that you said the privilege because it's such a privilege. And I've seen you in action, actually coaching leaders and just the grace in which you allow that space for somebody to just share that hard thing that's like on the tip of their tongue that they're afraid to say, that they can't move past. And moving through that is such a gift when someone trusts you in such a way to be vulnerable. And I've seen you be that person.
I love it when people feel safe enough to tell you what's true for them, right? Like that whatever is the hardest thing to say out loud, when they finally say it out loud, there's something really just magical that happens. And I love being a part of that.
I think if people are listening to this and they're managers, right? They're not necessarily, they don't have these coaching credentials that you have, but they manage people and they care about their people. What are some strategies or things that you would say to a manager that wants to be a good coach, but maybe doesn't do it very well? What are some things that you would tell someone that they should maybe think about sharpening their saw on with their skills?
Yeah. I mean, the best way to start as a leader, this is what I always tell students and clients, is just try to start shifting. If you think of a proportion of conversations that you have with your employees, and let's say right now, 80% of them, you're telling people what to do, and 20% you're asking questions and finding out how they're feeling. Just start shifting the numbers. Can you get to 50% asking versus telling? That's a great goal as a leader. When are the moments when it's going to be much more helpful for them, for you to try to dig in and find out what's really happening for them, rather than just providing the solution, which you may well know you could solve it in 30 seconds. But the learning that can happen for people when you just engage them in a little bit different way and let them get there themselves. That's such a great starting point, I think, for leaders.
What's maybe one of your 2 favorite coaching questions that you ask clients?
The number one question I probably ask clients is, how do you feel about that? I ask feeling questions a lot, especially of my executive leaders that I coach, because number one, they don't get asked that very often. And sometimes you haven't even really stopped to think about that, right? I don't know, how do I feel? And the pause of, oh, wait, I was just working with a client last week who was unpacking a situation. And as he was describing it, I feel like he might have been betrayed. Does it feel like betrayal? And the aha that went off for him, like just naming, oh, that's why I feel really crappy about this. That's probably my number one question that I ask.
I always like to ask, what does success look like? Especially, I feel like people are drawn to work with me that are high achieving and that they feel like that they're stuck. And a lot of times it's not so much that they're stuck, it's the mental gymnastics, their mindset. They think that they're stuck and they just got to recognize they're doing great things. So that, what does success look like? But I love that question of, how do you feel about that? I sometimes ask folks to tell me the emotion that you're experiencing right now, which when I ask that question, it's amazing to me how few emotions people recognize that they have in themselves. I'm happy, mad, I'm disappointed. It's like usually the common ones. And there's so many emotions that we have.
All of those emotions are trying to tell us something different. They're trying to communicate something different to us. And I think when we don't pause and really reflect on that, that's probably the biggest thing that I've learned for myself in the last 4 or 5 years as both a coach and a human. That's work I've had to do. In full disclosure, I'm not someone who's deeply connected to how I feel about things. I can push right past that. I'm fully capable of that and have a lot of empathy for people. Yeah, I'd pass. Like, oh, this is going to be uncomfortable. I'm not interested, right? And that's work that the more I slow down and make myself do that, the better and healthier I know I am. So I can only imagine that the same is true for my clients. So
I totally agree. Well, I would be remiss if I didn't go back to that one little thing you just kind of mentioned of like, oh yeah, I used to work for the government and the CIA. Talk to me about a little bit more about that, because I know you wrote a little book about that experience as well. So tell us more about that. Don't be shy. Share your greatness.
All right. I appreciate that. It's always kind of an awkward thing to talk about because I think from the outside, it can seem like a really strange, weird place to have worked. Not that many people have worked there. But what I always tell people is I had an incredibly regular job in an incredibly unusual organization full of people with really unusual jobs. But I did the exact same job I do now. I was a trainer of some sort almost the entire time I was there. I ended my career in the leadership school, but I did a lot of different types of training jobs when I was there. I started my very first job. I love to tell this story. My very first job there, I taught people how to properly store electronic records so that they could be like discoverable for like Freedom of Information Act discoveries and things like that. That happens when you work for the government. But I always tell people like, that's how I got good. That's how I got funny. Because man, if you can't make that like You better be able to do a stand-up act about that because people are going to be napping. Like it was boring, right? Really lame.
Yeah.
And also sometimes hard and complex and hard to understand. And that was when I got the bug of like, ooh, how do you teach somebody how to do this in a way that they can actually do it, right? And actually move the needle on it. So I started there. That project that I was working on, unfortunately, got shut down like 9 months in, I think, to my career. So I got moved to another division where I taught people how to classify documents. So how to decide whether something was top secret, which was super interesting and also sometimes hard. And I also had to learn a lot for that job because I had to know it to teach it. So I still get kind of cracked up by stories in the news now because there's a lot that I understand that the average person doesn't understand because of that job. And then that's when I really like started shifting into like my true passion, which was leadership development. So I had previously, before I started working for the government, I worked in HR, and the government liked that. They wanted more HR focused people in leadership training. So I fell right into that track and settled in and found my home. So.
And your book, Crisis Proof Leadership.
Crisis Proof Leadership. Yeah. So it's not, what I would say is it's not a book about the CIA. I tell some stories. Certainly there are some crisis moments that happen in those types of environments that there are things to learn from. But what I would say in general, the book is about, I started writing it in 2021, kind of post-pandemic, as, you know, I had all these clients, and I'm sure you did too, who were like, well, crap, the whole game of leadership just changed. Like, what are we supposed to be doing right now? I had a team that was in the office that's now virtual. I have employees who've got kids at home, not in school. How the heck am I supposed to deal with this as a leader? What do I do? What's most important for me? And so I started like doing all this research into like, well, what do I tell them? What are the best practices? Like, what should we be doing? And I didn't really like what I found because I think in general, how we've talked about crisis management, you know, in the past had been talked about as like, okay, a crisis happens. Here's this special toolkit that you're going to take out and you're going to do these 3 things and it's going to fix the crisis. And I just fundamentally disagree with that. I think the best leaders, especially we saw this play out in a lot of organizations during that time frame, the leaders who succeeded were the leaders who were already doing things well. And those things included knowing their people, having high trust relationships, meeting regularly with their people. It's not rocket science. It's not hard, but you've got to do those fundamentals. And if there was ever a time to pull up and say, gosh, what do my fundamentals look like? And sure, there's some tweaks to be made within those fundamentals. Maybe you've been doing weekly meetings. Maybe you need to do daily meetings for a while because of the crisis. Maybe you need to do twice a day meetings. Maybe something needs to change, but the fundamentals are still there. So that's really what the book is about. And I had the privilege of interviewing a lot of leaders who were in really interesting jobs during that time. I talked to a lot of healthcare leaders. That's my background, and healthcare had a lot of challenges to overcome in that time frame. I also happened to meet the county commissioner of Fort Lauderdale County, and they were the county that, if you remember, like back in 2020, there were people who were on cruise ships when the pandemic hit that needed to dock. And she was a part of the conversations about, do you let the cruise ships dock or not? So do you let this ship full of sick people dock in your county where there's not any sick people? What's the right call? So just really interesting stories that came out of the book too. So it was such fun to write.
I want to ask more about what you said with regards to leadership and management. Where do you feel influence plays a role in some of this? And how do you distinguish between coaching and influencing?
I think so much of leadership is influence. I'm not sure that there is a huge difference, right? You are trying to help influence people to do the thing that needs to be done. I think great leaders do that in a way that's about the other person. How is this opportunity for them? How is the thing that needs to be done, you know, structured in a way that works for them, lets their life be complete as a whole person, whatever those things look like. I'm a big proponent of servant leadership. I know you are too. And I think it's the only way to do it is to make it be about the other person. And I do think that's absolutely a form of influence. Those things go hand in hand.
I am on like a revolution, whatever you want to call it, that when I think about this, I think about leadership is about influence relationships, and management is about authority relationships. And so when you talked about, there were leaders during the pandemic, that the leaders that were doing it well were the managers that were already connected with their people. So those managers that already had established relationship, right? But there were people who didn't have a management title that ended up bubbling up to the surface as these great resilient leaders, as these empathetic leaders. And it was, I believe, a result of the relationships that they had, that the way that they connected with people, right? So I think that's super important. And I think as a manager who's coaching individuals, you have to be interested in the relationship as well as maintaining the boundaries of what that authority in your position requires of you.
Yeah, absolutely. And such a huge part of that is at its core, like, I don't care if you're just a coach or if you're a leader coach, you will never get somewhere with the person across the table from you if they don't trust you, if they don't feel safe. You're not going to be effective. And so you have to focus on that part first before you even attempt it.
I would love to know, what are common challenges that you've encountered in your coaching process and how did you overcome them? Because I think that some managers hear something like we're talking about today and we're like, okay, I'm going to start coaching, or they might believe I am a good coach. And then they run into that employee who maybe doesn't love them as much as their other employees do and doesn't get them. And then they're like, okay, well, what do I do with this person now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a tricky situation. And I would say more often than not, in those situations where you've got someone who's really struggling and you're trying to help, in my experience, almost always when I'm bumping up against resistance there, it's because either there's something going on I don't know that they won't tell me, right? There's some X factor that I don't know about. Or we've got like a legitimate fit issue, right? Like we are just trying to put a round peg in a square hole, and I can coach that all day, but we've got a square peg and it's not going to fit, right? Like there's only so much you can do with that. So another thing that I'm a big fan of is, how can you coach people to the right role? Like if it's not this, that's okay. Maybe it doesn't have to be the thing that they're doing right now that's clearly not working. Can it be something else? Is there something else that you can leverage and get them in a better fit position? And if not, then the best thing you can do for them as a leader, and I don't think we take this responsibility seriously enough sometimes as leaders, sometimes getting that person to leave the organization so they can go on to the job that they can knock it out of the park, we're doing them a favor. It doesn't feel like it. Like I know how hard it is. I've been there, but there's no way that that person is feeling fulfilled and cared about and getting the joy that they should be getting from work if you're bumping up against huge issues. Sometimes releasing them is the best thing you can do for you and them.
I've advised managers in the past to think about the amount of time that they're spending with their employees. And if they've got that one employee that they just feel like isn't getting it, or that one employee that they're spending, like I've spent so many hours, sometimes it's helpful to even just have that conversation with the employee and say, I spend 80% of my time having one-on-ones with you to get you on board, to get you to understand, to get you comfortable. Is this the place that you want to be successful? And tell me why. Tell me why you want to be here. And sometimes that just thinking through as a manager, who you're spending the most time with and what you're doing with that time can also be, I think, very revealing, because that's also exhausting for that manager as well, I think, to feel like that they have to keep selling them. It's like that approach isn't working. We got to try something different.
Yeah. And I know so many leaders who, and full disclosure, I have been this leader before, so there's no judgment here. But so often we see something go wrong and we think, oh, I'm not going to have a conversation with them this time because they'll figure it out. Like they realize they did something wrong. They're going to adjust. It's all going to be fine. I don't need to tell them. And maybe you do that for 90 days and now you've got a cluster. Maybe something blew up, like maybe they touched something that's got a bigger impact. So now this problem that was small is huge, or maybe things have built up, or maybe you've got another team member suddenly who's like, why doesn't this person have to do their job? Like I'm busting it over here and this person isn't, and we're getting the same paycheck. So maybe you lose a key player. So now you've got such a bigger problem that if you just try to get in there as soon as you notice the behavior, I don't think any behavioral issue has ever been solved through ignoring it. Like that's just never going to work out. And almost every issue like that can be solved with a conversation. The amount of conversations I have with sometimes really high level leaders. I was just on the phone with somebody last week who I thought, I cannot believe I'm saying this. But I said, what kind of conversation have you had with the person about this? I probably say that 3 times in every coaching conversation. So that's all helpful information. What kind of conversation have you had? What do they know about what you just shared with me? And the number of times that the answer to that is, I have not had any conversation. Well, there's your problem, right? There's your problem. That's it. I just solved it. So now we're going to prep for that conversation because that's what you need to do, right? Again, it doesn't matter level at all. I've worked with leaders, 40 years of leadership experience. Doesn't matter. They need that same nudge to have the conversation.
We have so many connections that I think connect our hearts to the work that we're doing. One of those is the love of the show Ted Lasso.
Oh my gosh.
So tell me how that has had an impact in your life and tell my friends about your show that talks about that.
Oh my gosh. So I started watching Ted Lasso, I think with the rest of the world. It came out, I feel like late 2020 was the first season, right? So like everybody needed a feel-good show. It came out, it lit the world on fire. But the more I watched it, the more I was like, well, dang it, this is a show about leadership. That it really is. The more I unpacked it, the more the episodes came out. Like, sure, it's heartwarming and it's funny and it's got comedy, but also, man, at its core, it's just about how do you be a good leader? So I was having a conversation with a dear friend of mine who you also know, Jason Barnaby, and we were talking about it. And he was like, yes, I was just thinking the same thing. And I was like, okay, Jason, we need to do a podcast. So we did. We started doing a podcast where we break down every episode and we talk about not just what happens in the show, which we definitely geek out about the show and share funny lines and that kind of thing. But also we deep dive into something leadership related that happened in that episode. In almost every show. And sometimes we bring in guests and sometimes it's just the two of us. But we did 3 seasons. There's a season for every Ted Lasso season. And we're wrapped now as the show is wrapped. But it's still out there and available. So if you're a Ted Lasso person, you can find it. It's the Diamond Dogs podcast with Beth and Jason. And I think there's something like 50 episodes maybe that are just waiting for you to binge. So it was such a labor of love. And we came at it with the vantage point of just like, if nobody listens, it doesn't matter. We're going to have a great time recording it and we'll have fun and that'll be it. And we kind of walked into it with very low expectations. So anytime I just got a message over the weekend from a friend of mine who had told her boss about the show and she'd started listening and she was like, oh, she came in and she told me how much she loved it and she's been binging it. And I was like, oh, I forget that people listen to it. Like, that's so nice to hear. Like, we mostly just had a great time recording it, but we have a decent listenership and always kind of cracks me up.
Well, Beth, if people are listening and they want to get connected with you or they want to get a copy of your book, what's the best way for them to reach out to you?
Yeah, so the book is available anywhere you buy books. So Amazon.com, Barnes & Nobles, all the normal places, Kindle, audio, paperback, all those things. The best way to get in touch with me personally is just via LinkedIn. I'm honestly not great about social media, in full disclosure. I'm better about it when I've got something like the podcast coming out every week. But like everybody, I get busy and I don't post probably as much as I should, but I'm there and I'm very responsive to instant messages. So if you message me on LinkedIn, I will absolutely respond. And it's just Beth Rashleigh on LinkedIn. That's the best place to find me.
Beth, thanks for being here. Thanks for sharing your wisdom and all your coaching advice. I so appreciate you.
Of course. Thanks for having me. It was a privilege.
Oh, what a great interview. I just love her vulnerability. I love that she's so unpretentious. She's such a good friend. She's such a great coach. I hope that you took some things away from that. Hey, did you know that we're on YouTube now? If you're interested in listening to this episode or seeing who my guest is, check out our YouTube channel. Go to www.youtube.com/@madeforimpact and subscribe to the show. I would love to hear what you think. I would love to have you check it out. I would love any feedback that you have because I love doing this show, but mostly I love hearing how it's making an impact on you. Remember, you are made for impact.